Part 1, Dramatic Hook, 250 words. December 6, 1941. Before dawn, the temperature outside Moscow plunges below -30 degrees Celsius. German Army Group Center, with over 1,500,000 soldiers and more than 1,000 Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, stands less than 20 kilometers from the Soviet capital. For months, Wehrmacht tank crews have dismissed the Soviet T-34 as a primitive machine. Its weld seems rough, optics inferior, and tankers poorly trained compared to the standards of the 4th Panzer Group. Yet across the frostbitten fields, something unexpected is about to unfold. At 0600 hours, reports reach Major General Hermann Hoth's headquarters. Soviet armored columns are massing along a 40-kilometer front. Initial estimates suggest 150 tanks, a manageable threat, or so German intelligence believes. But by noon, intercepted communications reveal a staggering figure. In just 10 days, between December 6 and 16, over 800 T-34 Model 1941 medium tanks are rushed by rail and driven directly from the factories at Gorky and Kharkov. These are not the scattered, understrength units the Germans faced in the summer. Instead, entire brigades, such as the 1st Guards Tank Brigade and the 27th Tank Brigade, now surge toward the front. Within hours, entire German panzer regiments find themselves outnumbered. The myth of German armored superiority, built on a summer of rapid victories, is shattered not by new tactics, but by the sheer, relentless appearance of wave after wave of T-34s, each bristling with a 76.2 mm F-34 gun, each advancing through the snow. Part 2, Historical Setup, 350 words. At precisely 0900 hours on December 7, 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Mikhail Katakov, commander of the 1st Guards Tank Brigade, convenes his staff at a frozen railway yard in Kalinin Oblast, 180 kilometers northwest of Moscow. The snow is waist-deep. Soviet workers, many of them women and teenagers, labor through the night at the Krasnoye Sormovo and Kharkov locomotive factories. Their task: assemble and dispatch as many T-34 Model 1941 tanks as possible, regardless of paint or finish. The tanks arrive on flatcars, engines still warm from factory testing. The German 11th Panzer Division, under the command of General Lieutenant Ludwig Krull, positions its Panzer III Ausf. J tanks, each armed with a 50 mm KWK-38L/42 gun, along the western approaches to Klin. Intelligence from the 2nd Panzer Army headquarters at Smolensk reports Soviet movements, but the scale is underestimated. Only 3 days earlier, German reconnaissance counted fewer than 200 Soviet tanks in the entire sector. By December 8, the Soviet High Command, Stavka, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, issues Directive No. 005868. It orders every available T-34 to be redirected to the Moscow front. The T-34 Model 1941, weighing 26.5 tons, features sloped 45 mm armor capable of deflecting most German anti-tank rounds at distances beyond 500 meters. Its Christie suspension and wide tracks allow it to maneuver through snow and mud where Panzer IIIs become bogged down. The Red Army's 20th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Andrei Vlasov, prepares to deploy the newly arrived tanks directly from the railheads. Many crews have never seen battle, but their orders are clear: drive the T-34s straight into the German lines. Over 800 T-34s, supported by KV-1 heavy tanks and T-60 light tanks, form a continuous line stretching from Volokholamsk to Tula. By December 9, the Wehrmacht's timetable for capturing Moscow collapses. German tankers, once confident in the superiority of their optics and tactics, now face a wall of steel advancing through the snow, a force unprecedented in both size and resilience on the Eastern Front. Part 3, Rising Tension, 300 words. At 0400 hours, December 10, forward observers of the 258th Infantry Division report the rumble of hundreds of tank engines west of Istra. By 0530 hours, Red Army artillery opens fire, signaling the start of the Soviet winter counteroffensive. Lieutenant Colonel Katakov's 1st Guards Tank Brigade, with 93 T-34s, advances in 3 waves. From the German perspective, Hauptmann Heinrich von Luttwitz of the 11th Panzer Division recalls watching lines of new Soviet tanks, their armor gleaming with frost, emerging from the morning mist. Our 50 mm rounds bounced off their hulls at 800 meters. At 0745 hours, the Panzer III platoons attempt a flanking maneuver east of Krukovo. Within minutes, two German tanks are disabled by direct hits from 76.2 mm F-34 guns. The radio network of Army Group Center becomes congested with urgent requests for air support and 88 mm flak batteries. At 1,000 hours, Colonel Ivan Yushchuk of the 27th Tank Brigade leads 120 more T-34s into the fray, overwhelming the German 5th Panzer Regiment. By 1200 hours, Major General Hoth's staff realizes the full extent of the crisis. Over 800 T-34s, many still with factory markings, are striking along a 60-kilometer front. German infantry of the 32nd Infantry Division report that enemy tanks appear to be everywhere, some with raw, unpainted armor, others still smelling of paint and oil. At 1,400 hours, as temperatures drop to -35 degrees Celsius, German tank crews abandon disabled vehicles, retreating under fire. The Soviet armored assault, relentless and numerically overwhelming, halts the advance on Moscow, forcing the Wehrmacht into the defensive for the first time on the Eastern Front. In the hours following the shattering Soviet onslaught, the German lines west of Moscow dissolve into chaos. By the evening of December 10, Lieutenant General Walter Model, recently arrived to take command of the battered 9th Army, surveys the icy devastation near Klin. He finds columns of destroyed vehicles half buried in snowdrifts, while ragged survivors straggle back on foot, faces blackened with frostbite. Reports filter in from divisional headquarters, entire battalions are missing, communications are down, and supply trucks lie abandoned, engines frozen solid. The once meticulous Wehrmacht now reels under the weight of its first strategic reversal on the Eastern Front. By December 12, Red Army reconnaissance elements probe deep into the German rear, disrupting field hospitals and ammunition depots. Soviet cavalry detachments, led by General Lev Davater, slice through isolated pockets of resistance north of Volokholamsk, capturing hundreds of stunned German soldiers. In field notes, a Soviet junior officer remarks, "The enemy flees before us, leaving their boots and rifles in the snow." Meanwhile, Luftwaffe squadrons based at Zutphen find their aircraft immobilized, fuel lines gelled solid and ground crews exhausted by the unyielding cold. New intelligence reaches the Soviet Stavka. Intercepted German radio traffic reveals confusion and growing desperation among Axis commanders. A decrypted message from Army Group Center laments, "We have neither winter clothing nor reserves." Morale is collapsing. On December 13, Soviet liaison officers in Moscow deliver urgent briefings to Marshal Zhukov, confirming that the German front is buckling along a broad arc from Klin to Tula. Zhukov, ever cautious, orders his advancing formations to maintain pressure but warns against overextension. The enemy is wounded, but not yet defeated. In the German rear, medical officers report soaring cases of frostbite and trench foot. By December 15, field hospitals are overwhelmed. The bitter cold claims more casualties than Soviet bullets. Civilians in nearby villages watch with disbelief as German troops, stripped of discipline, barter valuables for bread, shelter, or vodka. The myth of invincibility that once surrounded the Wehrmacht has vanished, replaced by an air of vulnerability and defeat. As the Soviet juggernaut continues its relentless push, German reinforcements dispatched from Smolensk and Vitebsk arrive too late to stem the tide. Fresh Soviet units, equipped with new Lend-Lease-Studebaker trucks and American winter boots, press forward, capturing abandoned German supply dumps stacked high with untouched rations and munitions. The rout becomes unmistakable. For the first time since June, the initiative belongs to the Red Army. This reversal of fortunes marks a profound shift, not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of both adversaries. Letters home from German soldiers, intercepted by Soviet intelligence, describe a winter of despair and endless retreat. Soviet war correspondents, meanwhile, file triumphant dispatches: Moscow is saved. The invader flees. The scale and speed of the Soviet counteroffensive take many by surprise, prompting a re-evaluation at every command level. The Red Army's ability to coordinate armor, infantry, and artillery in sub-zero conditions confounds German expectations. In Berlin, OKH analysts sift through telegrams and casualty lists, grasping for explanations. The technical superiority once claimed by the Panzerwaffe is now under question. Why did so many Soviet tanks survive, and why did German anti-tank guns fail? Military historians and surviving participants later point to a confluence of factors. The Red Army's deployment of vast numbers of T-34s, better adapted to the snow and mud than their German counterparts, proved decisive. The T-34's wide tracks distributed weight, allowing it to maneuver where German tanks bogged down. Its sloped armor, welded at sharp angles, deflected shots that would have penetrated the vertical plates of a Panzer III. Furthermore, factory-fresh tanks arrived at the front in waves, often manned by crews with minimal training but sustained by simple, rugged engineering. The German High Command had not anticipated the depth of Soviet reserves or the scale of their industrial mobilization. Intelligence estimates in October predicted no more than 200 operational Soviet tanks near Moscow. In reality, the Red Army fielded over 1,000 by mid-December. This miscalculation extended to operational doctrine as well. German tactics emphasized rapid encirclement and destruction of enemy formations, but these methods faltered in the face of fanatical Soviet resistance and inexhaustible manpower. The Wehrmacht's dependence on motorized supply columns, already strained by stretched lines and partisan raids, became a fatal liability in the deep freeze. Meteorological conditions amplified every shortcoming. The Russian winter, with its plunging temperatures and swirling blizzards, neutralized the mobility and firepower of the German army. Weapons jammed, lubricants thickened, and engines refused to start. Soviet forces, by contrast, had acclimatized over weeks, equipped with sheepskin coats, felt boots, and even portable stoves. German efforts to improvise wrapping feet in newspapers, lighting fires under tanks, proved woefully inadequate. The psychological toll was equally severe. For the first time, the myth of German invincibility was shattered. Letters and diaries from frontline troops reveal a sense of betrayal and disbelief. They promised us victory before Christmas. Now we freeze in a land without end. Meanwhile, Red Army morale soared. The defense of Moscow became a symbol of Soviet resilience, a living rebuke to Hitler's boast of a swift campaign. This dramatic reversal echoed historical precedents. In 1812, Napoleon's Grande Armée had fallen victim to the Russian winter. Now, Hitler's legions faced a similar fate. Yet, unlike Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, the Germans in 1941 found themselves not in headlong flight, but locked in a desperate struggle to hold their ground as Soviet pressure mounted along the entire front. The impact of the Soviet counteroffensive ripples through both armies' command structures. In Berlin, Hitler reacts with fury and disbelief, dismissing generals and assuming personal command of the Eastern Front. Orders are issued forbidding any retreat, regardless of local conditions. Commanders like Guderian and von Kluge protest, warning that rigid defenses will only increase losses. But dissent is silenced, the Führer's edicts are absolute. On the ground, German officers reorganize their shattered units, forming ad hoc alarm companies from cooks, clerks, and mechanics. Defensive positions are hastily constructed, trenches dug into the frozen earth, machine gun nests camouflaged with snow. Emphasis shifts from mobile warfare to static defense, hold the line at all costs, buy time for battered divisions to regroup. For the Soviets, the victory at Moscow is both vindication and warning. While the Red Army's momentum is undeniable, logistical strains mount, fuel shortages, overextended supply lines, and mounting casualties in the bitter cold. Commanders debate whether to press the attack or consolidate gains. Stalin, emboldened by success, urges relentless pursuit, but frontline generals warn that exhaustion threatens combat effectiveness. New orders flow from Soviet headquarters. Armored spearheads are to maintain pressure but avoid isolation. Infantry and support units must catch up, bridging the gaps left by rapid advances. The Red Air Force, buoyed by the immobilization of the Luftwaffe, increases reconnaissance flights, seeking opportunities to exploit the enemy's weakness. As December turns to January, the front settles into a grim stalemate punctuated by savage local battles. The Wehrmacht, battered but not broken, clings to precarious positions west of Moscow. The Red Army, buoyed by victory but mindful of the cost, prepares for the next phase of the winter campaign. The battle for Moscow has ended, but the war for the East is only beginning. In the frozen forests and ruined villages of Russia, a new chapter of the conflict unfolds, one defined by endurance, adaptation, and the relentless will of two nations locked in a struggle for survival. Part 1: Lesser-known details. The weeks after the battle for Moscow were marked not only by military maneuvering, but also by a daily struggle for survival rarely captured in official reports. German foot soldier Otto Klemper, assigned to a rear area signals unit, recorded in his battered notebook, "We have not seen bread in 5 days. Horses are dying where they stand, frozen to the ground. The radio works only when someone volunteers to stand outside and crank the generator by hand. Such accounts reveal a world far removed from the orderly dispatches filed by headquarters. On the Soviet side, logistical improvisation became a matter of life and death. Despite the Red Army's successful counteroffensive, the sudden advance outpaced their supply networks. A declassified Soviet quartermaster's report from January 1942 admits 30% of forward units lack proper winter boots. Many receive only cold tea and a handful of dried fish for days. In some sectors, women and children from nearby villages were conscripted to haul ammunition and food on sledges, often through waist-deep snow, braving temperatures that regularly dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Contrary to official German communiques boasting of orderly withdrawal and consolidation, the reality was chaos. Wehrmacht officers sent panicked requests for more winter clothing and antifreeze lubricants, only to be reprimanded for defeatist attitudes. A Wehrmacht medical officer in the 4th Army wrote home, "Frostbite is now our main enemy." The wounded die before they reach the field hospitals, not from bullets, but from the cold. Meanwhile, vehicles abandoned for lack of fuel or maintenance littered the landscape, their engines seized and tracks buried beneath new snowdrifts. Environmental factors shaped every aspect of life at the front. The infamous Rasputitsa, the Russian freeze-thaw cycle, turned roads into rivers of mud by day and sheets of ice by night. Horses, still the backbone of both armies' logistics, often broke legs on hidden ruts or collapsed from exhaustion. Even the celebrated Soviet T-34 tank, famed for its winter performance, suffered when snow clogged its air intakes or the fuel thickened in the lines. In the forests and marshes between the lines, partisans and foraging squads scoured for anything edible: potatoes, stray chickens, even bark peeled from trees. Some German patrols, cut off for days, resorted to boiling leather straps to stave off hunger. The official doctrine of no retreat clashed with ground-level reality. Isolated outposts quietly fell back or melted into the woods, their disappearance unmentioned in daily reports. Part 2: Historian Perspectives. For decades, the winter of 1941-42 was depicted in both Soviet and Western histories as a straightforward turning point, a triumph of Russian resilience and a blunder of German overreach. Early post-war analyses, shaped by Cold War politics, emphasized Stalin's leadership and the heroism of the common soldier, while often glossing over the Red Army's logistical nightmares and the scale of civilian suffering. The opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s, however, forced a major reassessment. Documents revealed that Soviet success was far more precarious than previously admitted. Newly available Stavka orders show that several Red Army offensives in January and February 1942 ended in catastrophic losses, with entire divisions encircled and destroyed due to inadequate supplies and communications breakdowns. Historian David Glantz notes, "The Red Army's victory at Moscow was genuine, but it came at a price few understood at the time, a price paid in squandered men and material beyond what official accounts suggested." Declassified German records have also reshaped the narrative. Wehrmacht war diaries and intercepted radio messages show that Hitler's refusal to allow tactical withdrawals led to the needless loss of entire regiments, not just due to Soviet attacks, but from starvation and cold. In a 2018 study, historian Alexandra Ritchie points out that more German soldiers died from exposure and disease in the winter of 1941-42 than from enemy fire, a fact long underplayed in German memoirs and official histories. Contemporary scholarship now focuses on the interplay between environmental hardship, leadership failure, and the resilience or breaking point of ordinary soldiers. Ongoing debates center on whether the German defeat before Moscow was inevitable given logistical constraints, or whether different decisions at the highest levels might have altered the course of the campaign. Some Russian scholars, meanwhile, challenge the traditional narrative of unbroken Soviet heroism, highlighting the continuing cost paid by peasants and partisans in the occupied hinterlands. Part 3: Human Stories. Among the thousands caught between shifting fronts was Maria Fedorova, a schoolteacher from Klin, northwest of Moscow. When German forces occupied her town, Maria hid Red Army stragglers in her cellar and risked her life to pass information to partisan bands. After the German retreat, she was awarded the Order of the Red Banner, but the war left its mark. "I taught children to read before the war. After, I taught them to remember the names of the dead." Maria lived until 1980, retiring as a headmistress, her wartime courage seldom discussed in public but quietly honored by her students. On the German side, Hans Richter, a mechanic from Danzig, spent the winter maintaining vehicles for the 10th Panzer Division. In a letter home dated February 1942, he wrote, "We fix what we can, but the cold makes metal brittle, and our fingers crack and bleed. I dream of warm bread and the sound of my father's voice." Captured during the Red Army's spring offensive, Hans survived a Siberian POW camp and eventually returned to Germany in 1949. He never worked as a mechanic again. His hands, frostbitten in Russia, were too damaged. Nikolai Varnin, a Red Army junior lieutenant from Saratov, saw his first combat during the January offensives west of Moscow. Wounded by shrapnel, he was evacuated to a hospital in Gorky. In a memoir published decades later, Varnin recalled, "The pain was less from the wound than from the memory of friends left behind in the snow. Their faces come to me in dreams." After the war, Nikolai became a railway engineer, helping rebuild the very tracks over which both armies had fought. These individual stories of endurance, loss, and quiet heroism echo through the archives and personal papers left behind. The winter of 1941-42 was not just a clash of armies, but a crucible for millions whose lives would be forever shaped by the long, frozen months on the edge of Moscow. The legacy of that winter endures, imprinted on memories and histories, in ways no official communiqué could ever capture. Part 1: Strategic Consequences. In the days that followed the Red Army's halt of the German advance, the front lines around Moscow solidified into a tense stalemate. German commanders, shaken by the losses and environmental devastation, issued emergency directives to fortify existing positions and pull back exposed units. These immediate tactical shifts forced the abandonment of forward outposts and the hurried construction of defensive works, as both sides braced for a brutal spring thaw. Within weeks, German supply officers were rerouting precious resources from planned offensives elsewhere to shore up the battered Army Group Center. Trains loaded with replacement troops and ammunition, originally destined for the southern and northern fronts, were redirected to patch the gaps left by the failed Moscow campaign. This reallocation created cascading shortages across the Eastern Front, weakening German attacks on Leningrad and delaying the spring push into the Caucasus. By the spring and summer of 1942, the consequences multiplied. The Wehrmacht, deprived of momentum and suffering from attrition, could not recover quickly enough to launch a decisive offensive in the north or south. Soviet planners, emboldened by their survival, began preparations for deeper counterstrokes. Reserve armies were reconstituted with new recruits drawn from across the vast Soviet hinterland. The Red Army's logistical apparatus, though still strained, gradually improved, and a new generation of officers hardened by the winter's ordeal rose in the ranks. As months turned to years, the effects rippled outward. The German failure to seize Moscow shattered the aura of Nazi invincibility and galvanized resistance movements across occupied Europe. Soviet propaganda seized on the victory to rally the home front and inspire partisans behind enemy lines. Allied leaders in London and Washington, previously uncertain of the USSR's endurance, accelerated Lend-Lease shipments and began planning for a second front in Western Europe. The inability to deliver a knockout blow in the East forced Hitler into a grinding war of attrition, a war his armies were ill-prepared to sustain. When the war finally ended in 1945, the memory of the Moscow campaign lingered. It shaped the post-war division of Europe, the boundaries of the Iron Curtain, and the fate of millions displaced by shifting borders. The hard lessons learned about logistics, resilience, and the limits of military ambition became case studies in military academies on both sides of the Cold War divide. Part 2: Turning Point Analysis. Had the German advance not been checked outside Moscow, the trajectory of the Second World War might have been dramatically altered. Historians have long debated the plausibility of a German capture of the Soviet capital. Some argue that, even had Moscow fallen, the vastness of Soviet territory and the willingness of the population to resist would have made total victory elusive. Others contend that the psychological and logistical blow dealt by losing the city could have fractured Soviet command and control, perhaps forcing a negotiated peace or even government collapse. Comparisons are often drawn to Napoleon's ill-fated 1812 march on Moscow, another campaign where logistical overreach and environmental hardship undid a seemingly unstoppable army. Yet the winter of 1941-42 stands apart in scale and significance. Unlike Napoleon, who managed to enter a deserted Moscow, Hitler's armies were denied even the symbolic capture, an outcome that shattered German morale and emboldened Soviet resistance. Consensus among contemporary scholars is that the failure before Moscow marked a fundamental turning point. The German army, hitherto undefeated, now faced the reality of a two-front war it could not easily win. The Soviet victory, while Pyrrhic in its immediate cost, proved the Red Army's capacity to absorb and recover from catastrophic losses. Over the decades, as more archival material has come to light, historians have refined their understanding of just how close the balance tilted. Early Soviet triumphalism and German self-justification have given way to a nuanced appreciation of contingency. The outcome was far from predetermined. Modern analysis emphasizes the interplay of weather, leadership, and sheer endurance, a convergence of factors that no single side could fully control. The winter outside Moscow did not decide the war in a single stroke, but it irreversibly shifted its momentum. The campaign became a touchstone for both Soviet and German military doctrine, studied, debated, and dissected for generations. Part 3: Legacy and Memorial. The war's survivors navigated lives forever marked by their experiences. Maria Fedorova, who had risked everything to aid partisans, became a figure of quiet reverence in her community. In the post-war decades, her story inspired local commemorations and, eventually, a plaque at her former school in Klin, one of countless small memorials scattered across Russia's heartland. Hans Richter, the German mechanic scarred by frostbite, was among millions who returned to a homeland transformed by defeat and division. In the 1950s, West German veterans associations published his letters alongside those of other former soldiers, not as glorification, but as testimony to the human cost of war. Decades later, a reunified Germany erected a modest monument in Berlin's Invalidenfriedhof cemetery honoring all who suffered on the Eastern Front, victims and combatants alike. Nikolai Varnin, the wounded lieutenant who rebuilt railways, took part in annual Victory Day parades well into old age. His memoir became required reading in military academies, not for tales of heroism, but for its unflinching account of loss, endurance, and the price paid by ordinary soldiers. Across Russia, Germany, and beyond, museums and memorials now preserve the artifacts and memories of that fateful winter. The Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow, and the German-Russian Museum in Berlin-Karlshorst, offer exhibitions that grapple with the campaign's legacy, its suffering, its lessons, and its warning. Military scholars continue to analyze the campaign's failures and innovations, shaping doctrines on mobility, logistics, and adaptation in extreme conditions. The winter of 1941-42 on the outskirts of Moscow became more than a military episode, it set the stage for the world that followed. Its legacy is measured not just in history books, but in the enduring scars and silent memorials that dot the landscape of two continents. More than 3 million men became casualties in the Moscow campaign. Their fate irrevocably altered the course of the Second World War, and with it, the shape of the modern world.